psychyogi.org. Hazelwood and Douglas, the lust murderer. Background. This is the first study we'll be looking at from the Making a Profile section of Making a Case as part of your OCR A2 psychology exam. It's further categorised into top-down. Well, firstly, what is profiling? Well, profiling is a range of characteristics proposed by a psychologist of an offender to the police in order to narrow down the scope of their investigation. The background study for this theory is Holmes and Holmes, 1989. Offender or criminal profiling is simply the attempt to predict and create the likely traits and behaviours of an offender of a crime. The likelihood is that you could have already begin to have a guess at the type of person that committed a crime. For example, if 3 women are found strangled and sexually assaulted at 3 different but closely located train stations, it's quite likely that a male committed these offences. Criminal profiling is done by professionals and is in essence what we just did, but it goes into far more depth. Holmes and Holmes, 1989, identified 3 aims of profiling. Aim 1, social and psychological assessments. Aim 2, psychological evaluation of belongings. And aim 3, interview suggestions and strategies. Okay, so aim 1, social and psychological assessments. This considers the following factors when starting out with the profile. So the first thing they'll do is they'll say, well, what type of personality was this person? Are they an aggressive person or are they quieter? What's their age? Is this the crime committed by an old person or is it by someone who's younger? Is there any indication of their race or ethnicity? What about gender? The type of employment or employed status. So are they unemployed? Are they employed? What's their likely job? So in a case what we'll look at in a few studies' time with John Duffy, David Cantor was able to predict that John Duffy, who was the railway rapist, would have a job that would involve very little contact with the public, but he probably would know the railway somehow. And it turned out he worked in a job maintaining the railway. So he wasn't in contact with the public, but he did know the railways quite well. Marital status, is there anything that would suggest that this person was married or not? So this could be witness statements saying, well, he was wearing a ring or something like that. Level of education. As we'll look at in further studies, you can look at a crime and see if it's organised or disorganised, and this is actually this study that we're going to look at. And organised crimes tend to have people who are highly educated or higher. They have a higher level of education than people who are disorganised in their crimes. Aim 2, psychological evaluation of belongings. So once aim 1 has been completed and a profile of the offender has been made, the profiler should attempt to suggest any possessions that may be linked to the crime scene. For example, seen souvenirs. So is this person going to collect things? So there was quite a number of cases of rapists who end up collecting shoes or photographs of the scene. There's also specific pornography that could be linked to the crime in question. The sort of crime that's been committed may have the criminal who's committed it may be in possession of pornography which is related to the crime which they have committed. Completing this aim allows the police detectives involved in the case to list any such evidence that they need in a search warrant. So it's highly useful. Aim 3, interviewing suggestions and strategies. So this aim is based on the fact that everyone's different and certain people are going to try to evade the police's questions, or they're going to be people who are very put off by the police or susceptible to lying, as we found in the Good Johnson and McKeith documentation of false confessions. So aim 3, the profiler should make suggestions about how best to interview the suspect. Again, individuals will respond differently to questions. and this will depend on the nature of their crime, their personality, and their motivation for committing the crime. Remember, if someone wanted to get caught and wanted to have the thrill of getting caught, they're going to answer questions differently to someone who is trying to evade arrest or trying to evade being convicted. According to Boone and Davis, 1992, there are two primary approaches to profiling. The top-down approach, which is used by the American FBI, and the bottom-up approach used by the British. We're going to be focused on the top-down approach, and the top-down approach was produced from a series of in-depth interviews with 36 convicted sexually orientated murderers, including Ted Bundy and Charles Manson. The profiler uses the evidence from the crime scene to create the profile of the offender and then uses typologies to advise the police of interview techniques and the potential for reoffending. An example of the typologies: if the crime has been well planned and it is a murder, then it suggests the likely characteristic of an offender with an above average IQ. Obviously, if the crime has been poorly planned, it's likely to suggest that the person has a below average IQ. These just suggest things. It's not concrete that this will always happen. And some crimes may actually display more than one type of organised or disorganised element, as we'll find. The top-down approach attempts to classify offenders into types. These types are based upon the nature of the crime, the violence involved, the motivations, and the offender's likelihood to reoffend. Hazelwood and Douglas 1980 described the beginnings of the top-down approach in their theory. Okay, so now we're actually onto the theory. There's a lot of background there. Hazelwood and Douglas published their account of the Lust murderer, in which they advanced their theory of the organised and disorganised offender for the first time. Their theory postulates the beginnings of the typological approach to offender profiling, which has continued to develop ever since in America. Their theory suggests that a crime scene is similar to a fingerprint, in that a crime scene can be used to identify the offender in a similar manner to a fingerprint. As we've mentioned, there are two main typologies: organised offenders and disorganised offenders. Both of these typologies can be inferred from a crime. Now, the reason this is called the top-down approach is because what the profiler will go in and do is they'll look at the crime scene and try and fit the evidence in the crime scene to these already existing typologies of either organised or disorganised. They don't look at the evidence and then try and build a picture from the bottom up, from the actual crime scene, and then try and build the profile from that evidence. They go in with these typologies and try to fit it into one of these, the crime into one of these typologies. That's why it's called the top down, because they're starting from the top with the typologies and going down looking for the evidence for either one. An organised offender will exhibit the following qualities: they will lead an orderly life and will kill after experiencing a critical event in their life. This is if they kill people. Their actions will reflect both planning and control. This can be seen if they have brought restraints to the scene or a weapon. The crime scene will therefore reflect order and planning. The organised offender is more likely to use a verbal approach with the victims. The organised offender is likely to be of high or above intelligence, socially competent, and is more likely to be employed than disorganised offenders. The organised offender will exhibit the following qualities: they are likely to have committed the crime in the heat of the moment. Their crimes will display no pre-planning or thought. This will be shown by their use of items already at the scene. They may have left blood, semen, fingerprints, and the murder weapon behind. This organised offender is likely to be less intelligent and socially competent than the organised offender. Hazelwood and Douglas evaluation. Remember, this is not an exhaustive list. This has actually been successfully used in Canada and the Netherlands, and it's also been used in the US, and it's been used to help solve a number of high-profile cases, and that's from Ainsworth 2000. Another strength is that the theory works well with crime scenes that present evidence in such a way to help identify the typology of the offender. As we'll find later with David Cantor's critique of this study, it's not necessarily easy, and this is sort of a weakness to it, it's not necessarily always easy to find organised and disorganised elements of a crime. It may be that offenders use both, so you couldn't really say which is which, because you may have missed something, or some things may have happened by accident, so it's very difficult to say. Another weakness is the theory is not based upon psychological principles, therefore we can say it's lacking in validity. Another weakness is that the profiles created from the application of this theory may be based upon the subjective interpretation of the individual profiler. It may be very difficult to actually get a single profile from one crime scene. Suppose we have 5 different people who are all profilers, and we all send them into the crime scene. With a top-down approach, in fairness, this actually is quite easy to get either an organised or a disorganised offender. But there's still room for error here, because we're not saying anything that's concrete. Each profiler may go in and see the crime scene in a completely different way to one another, so they'll come out with different profiles, which could in fact impair the police's investigation rather than help it. The typologies are limited to murderers and rapists, as this was how they found it from interviewing the 36. Another weakness is speculating about offenders' motives may not prove helpful in apprehending the offender. Did they do this for money? Did they do this because they hate someone? It's not always the most helpful thing in actually finding the person. Another weakness is that classification is not greatly detailed. If you enjoyed this, there's more at psychyogi.org.